Dear colleagues, dear friends of the Macau Ritchie Institute and the University of St. Joseph in Macau, a warm welcome to today's forum. I would especially warmly welcome Professor Edmund A., as well as Professor Hans-Georg Müller from the University of Macau.
Right, so good evening to all from Macau. It's now 6:30 in the evening here, right? And it's my pleasure to present this paper at the Macau Ritchie Institute Forum. The paper was written last year, so I actually went to relook it this week, and I added a few more. I added a bit of information which is not in the paper, so to help us to understand what Confucian spirituality would look like. Okay. So for those who read the paper, you might see something new. Right? So for those who didn't read the paper, don't worry about it. It should be understandable by itself. Right. So today I'm just going to speak about what holiness and spiritual transformation would look like in classical Confucianism. Specifically is about the Daxue, which is the greater learning. Okay. So it might be, shall we say, unusual, it might be surprising for an audience member to hear that somebody is researching on Confucian spirituality. Okay. It's a relatively small niche area of research. Okay. It's not very new. Okay. For example, Tu Weiming and Mary Tucker have published on this topic, Confucian spirituality. It was published almost 18 years ago. Right, it's in 2 volumes, right? So we can see on the slides, right? However, I have not been able to find very much else on any detailed research on the topic of Confucian spirituality. Right? It's an edited volume, and they deal with these topics on the conception of spiritual progress. What would the virtues relate to Confucianism as a religion? And of course, the worldview. What is the relationship between Ren and Tien, heavenly and the human, and even individualism and holism. So these topics, these papers are found in the edited volume. Right? But other than the work of Tu and Tucker, I've only managed to find a couple of journal papers on this topic, Confucian spirituality. So if anybody knows research material on this topic, can let me know during the Q&A. I'll be very curious to study this area, right? But for anybody who is new to the topic of Confucian spirituality, this would be the best resource at the moment. Right. So the paper is rather exploratory. Okay. So I begin with 2 research questions. Right. So the question will be this: how does a Confucian understand holiness? Is it possible? And the second question would be, what would spiritual transformation look like? Specifically, is there a process by which one grows in one's spirituality, in the Confucian conception? So let us look for a possibility in the concept of holiness in Confucianism. Certainly, there will be some problems that the respondent will bring up. Right? So let us begin this way. So we are probably used to the idea of holiness in the religious sense, right? So for example, in Christianity, holiness refers to the state of dedication to God, or a person dedicated to God, or a thing consecrated for a sacred purpose, right? So this is a religious sense, right? So another possibility is to think of holiness in the philosophical sense, right? So holiness could refer to an achievement of excellence, right? Being virtuous. So then being excellent can mean morally or spiritually. So I suggest that there's this conception of holiness in the moral or spiritual sense in Confucianism, right? So this will be possible. So I leave aside the question about whether Confucianism is a religion. Okay? So let's approach Confucianism from a philosophical sense and see if we can find a concept that would correspond to holiness. So I located this virtue, which is called cheng. Right? This seems to be a possibility for conveyance of holiness. So this character is normally translated as sincerity. Okay? So for those who know Chinese, right, it has two. This character is made of two components. Right? So the left side is yan, which means speech, right, and then the right side is cheng, which means to complete or to accomplish, right? And so the character cheng has the meaning of integrity or unity, and it conveys the sense of wholeness or completeness, right? And I suggest that we can consider using this virtue to signify holiness in the philosophical sense. And what I'm trying to get at is that the virtue of cheng as wholeness could refer to the state of having completeness in terms of the virtues, the moral virtues. And yesterday I was thinking of this, that in classical Confucianism, there is an objective for moral cultivation or spiritual transformation, and that would be sheng, the achievement of sagehood. And so the virtue of cheng may be the means, the practice by which one attains sagehood. And I also suggest, it's not in the paper, but I was thinking about it yesterday. So I suggest that the concept of a holy person could be expressed by sheng. Yeah. And this is because the virtue of cheng and the sheng are closely related in the Zhongyong. You can see it's in chapter 30, 31, and 32. Right? But that's not the main part of the paper today. It's just a comment on the holy person and holiness. Right? So let us go to the main part of the paper, and that would be the process of spiritual transformation. So I begin from this Christian point of view. Right? So this is quite famous, I suppose. Many people know about this. Probably those in the audience are familiar with this. Right? So in the Christian conception, there are the three stages of the spiritual life, right? Or it's also called the three ages. Right? So the purgative, illuminative, and the unitive. Right? And the theologian, Thomas Aquinas, speaks about the beginners, the proficient, and the perfect. So this is an explanation of the process of holiness, growth in holiness, that begins from baptism until one's attainment of perfection in heaven. And so spiritual transformation in Christianity would be largely understood as a growth in one's personal relationship with God. And of course, St. Thomas understands it as perfection as the perfection of holiness, as the perfection of charity. So the purgative stage is to rid oneself of mortal sin, and then the illuminative stage is the growth in virtue, and then the unitive stage is the union with God by the perfection of charity. So there are these three stages that starts from baptism, first conversion, and then to ongoing conversion till perfection, or what we call sainthood. So let me just make a clarification, right? So I'm not suggesting that Christianity and Confucianism share the same conception of holiness. No, right? In fact, they do not even share the same conceptions of purgation, illumination, or union. Right? But what I'm suggesting in the paper is that the two traditions may be comparable. Okay? We can discuss this in the Q&A. It seems to me that Confucianism thinks about spiritual transformation also in terms of three distinct and progressive stages. Right? So I will present now the evidence for this argument. Right? So let's look at the first line of the Daxue, the greater learning. Okay? So we have here, the way of greater learning lies in manifesting the original brightness of innate virtue. So that's the first stage. It lies in restoring the original brightness of that virtue in the people generally. Second stage, and the third one is, it lies in coming to rest in the utmost goodness. Right. So I'm going to present the breakdown, the analysis of three stages, and I'm getting this from Daxue. He's a neo-Confucian philosopher, and he wrote a commentary on the Daxue. So this is what I call the purgative stage, meaning manifesting the original brightness of innate virtue. Right. So Daxue actually says, that the main objective of the beginner is to overcome one's selfish desires. So Daxue thinks that heaven endows human beings with original goodness in our nature, but due to our endowment, our material dimension, this goodness is covered up, obscured, and what we need to do is to polish or to restore this original goodness. So there's an idea of purgation in the first stage of meaning. And then the second stage of restoring the original brightness of that virtue in the people generally, also called qin, to be kind to the people, maybe. And I suggest that in the second stage, there is the idea of illumination, because the objective of the proficient is to promote virtue in others after having restored one's original goodness. So if we think about virtue as manifesting the original brightness, then illumination is to bring out the virtue of others. So it's illumination by enhancing the virtue of others after bringing out the virtue in oneself. There's illumination in that sense. And the third stage, I call it unitive, 止于至上, yes, coming to rest in the utmost goodness. And so in this third stage, the main concern of the perfect is to reach supreme good. And this implies consummation or completion to reach the maximum of goodness that one can discover. And there's union in the sense that we reach the final end of the spiritual process. And I think that there is the unitive meaning, because there is a completion. So you will notice that there is the idea of consummation or completion, and this seems to be connected to cheng, which I alluded to earlier. In the same chapter, the first chapter of the Daxue, the text tells us that there are 8 steps to spiritual progress: 格物、知至、诚意、正心、修身、齐家、治国 and 平天下. Right? So the first one is investigation of things. The second one is perfecting knowledge. The third one is important for our consideration, cheng yi. So I translate it as forming holy intentions, and then ratifying the mind. And probably we are more familiar with the last 4: cultivating the self, regulating the household, ordering the state, and bringing peace to the world. So there are these 8 steps, and Daxue thinks about the 8 steps as an elaboration of the 3 stages. So the next part of the argument is to look at how spiritual progress takes place using the steps outlined in the Daxue. So again, this is from Daxue's commentary. So in the first stage of Ming Ming De, Daxue thinks that we have to accomplish the first 5 steps. So we start by investigating things, nature as well as reality, perfecting knowledge, forming the right intentions, clarifying the mind so that one can manifest original goodness through self-cultivation. So the first 5 steps do with purgation. And then Daxue says that the last 3 have to do with bringing virtue in others. So it's very logical, right? So we have regulating the household, ordering the state, and bringing peace to the world. So I call this the illuminative stage. This is how to be kind to the people. Now, interestingly, Daxue thinks that the third stage of 止于至上, resting in utmost goodness, is a repetition of the 8 steps. And he thinks of it in 2 parts. So the first part is knowing supreme goodness. The second part is attaining the supreme goodness. Right? So one finds out the utmost goodness by investigating things and then perfecting knowledge. So this is for the perfect. In my account, the holy person strives for utmost goodness first by discovering it through investigating things and perfecting knowledge. And this is interesting for me, that the process of attaining ultimate good lies in 5 steps. And it begins with cheng. We see this again, right? The virtue that we spoke of earlier. So the holy person manages to find union with supreme good by forming holy intentions, rectifying the mind, and then cultivating oneself and others. So the unitive stage, 止于至善, requires a profound repetition of the 8 steps. It is done by the person who has acquired virtue and repeats the steps to attain a higher degree of moral goodness for oneself and for others. So we saw earlier that this analysis is inspired by the 3 stages of the spiritual life in Christianity. So we saw earlier that in Christianity, spiritual transformation is growth in charity for God. Firstly, detachment from mortal sin, then growth in virtue, and then perfection of charity. What we see in Confucianism would be something different. So spiritual transformation is seen largely in one's relationship with oneself and with others. So it is, shall we say, it is spiritual and worldly, in the spiritual in the worldly sense. So to conclude, the purgative stage involves cultivation of virtue, and this is directed to oneself. The illuminative stage is to help others to cultivate virtue, and the unitive stage is to develop a love for supreme goodness and to be committed by it, by striving for moral and spiritual excellence. Good. So that's the end of my presentation for today, and I look forward to any comments or remarks from the respondent and then from the audience.